Good morning, everybody. Happy, isn't it, time they went back to school day? And welcome to the news agenda with me, Fleet Street Fox. And today I'm joined, I hope, by the Mirror's political correspondent, Sophie Huskisson. Hello, morning, Sophie.
Hello, I'm here for now.
We've had some technical issues this morning, which is why we're a little bit late. But it is the middle of August. No one really cares. If anybody's watching, that's why we're late. And if anybody's watching and sees Sophie suddenly freeze, I'm just going to burble for a bit. So you guys start talking to me, otherwise I'll be talking to myself. Now, this is the People's Paper Review, so get into the comments, ask us your questions. Those of you listening later on podcast will just have to hope you can stop a boat by completely ignoring it. Now, what have we got today? Well, the Mirror has splashed on one very lucky baby who escaped unharmed when the tent it was sleeping in at a Welsh campsite was rolled over by a car that had come off the road. More on that with eyewitness accounts inside the paper. But first, I want to take us to page 19, where the devastation of last week's wildfires on Hawaii is becoming obvious, with the body count rising as people have started picking through the debris. Now, residents are wondering how on earth they're going to rebuild or indeed find somewhere to live while they do it. Now, Sophie, the cost of all this, social and economic, is going to be simply just massive. But now it seems that there's evidence that it happened because the officials didn't want to pay to avoid it, isn't there? Take us through this story. What's it say?
Well, yeah, I mean, this is a very, very difficult, sensitive story. We've got, nearly up to 5,000 people, 4,500, who are waiting to be sheltered. The death toll's now hit 93, and we're expecting that to go up more. And I mean, we've had Biden obviously declare this as a disaster, but yeah, the cost issues all around this are very difficult. People are saying that they have been requesting certain things to have helped stop the fires in their paths, including thinning vegetation or generally more disaster support, and that hasn't been coming in. And I think, as we were sort of just saying in the backstage room, that this is kind of a trend that we've been seeing across the world. We've obviously seen wildfires ravaging across Europe at the start of the summer as well. But contingency planning for climate disasters isn't catching up in the rate that we want to see. And we can even think about this with COVID. If you all saw the David Attenborough documentary just after COVID, who says, this is linked to the climate. This is what happens when you ruin certain habitats, and certain animals are impacted. And through that then means that other animals like rats and bats that can carry COVID are not eaten in the same way. There's a lot more of them, and they can carry certain diseases to humans. And this, I guess, is a global conversation around climate change and really facing up to the kind of threats that we are facing now. Wildfires are only going to get worse. And, we have a disaster being declared after the wildfires come out from Biden, but we should be declaring climate change potentially a disaster far before we have to see the impacts.
That might have been, with hindsight, the most sensible way of doing it. Now, what do you think, everybody? Do you think that this is the kind of thing that people should be planning for and expecting to happen? The mitigation of the climate problems has to happen before you can fix it. You can't just switch off oil or gas tomorrow and the environment goes back to normal on Wednesday. It takes years to settle down again. So you are going to have these issues, even if everything went well as far as going to net zero and everything is concerned. And it's not going well because exactly of the thing that Sophie's just mentioned. So what do you think people should be doing? It's almost like a microcosm of the Green debate, really. So this is a report that was written in 2014, 9 years ago, by people on Hawaii saying we're going to have wildfires and Lahaina is going to be burnt to a crisp unless we start doing some of these things. And apparently the officials at the time said, that's all rather expensive, don't think it's necessary. So they didn't do it. And look what has befallen the Heine. Now, this is like, it's like a microcosm of the debate that we seem to keep having here in this country, and indeed all over the developed world, which has got the wealth and the privilege and the power to pollute the rest of the world, where we talk all the time about the cost of things, about the cost of ULEZ and low emission zones, or eco heating systems, or using vegetable oil instead of kerosene. And those arguing all the time that it's too expensive and voters won't stand for this green crap and that kind of stuff. They never once talk about the cost of not doing it, which is immense, because eventually we all end up paying these prices. John says, how can you plan for it when the Republican Party is so crazy? Fortunately, the craziness of the Republican Party sort of seems to have affected our own, and indeed some of the right-wing conservative parties all around the world. It's like a movement that can't really be stopped. But we all end up paying this price, don't we? So it's higher prices, home contents insurance, higher price of food and goods, even within our own countries. Movements of people away from the danger area where you might flood or catch fire to somewhere else. So people going on, we don't want you all living here. It was nice before you turned up. People want to move away from the floodplain, away from the cliff, not next to the scrubland that can catch fire. It's the entire problem just rolled up in one tiny story.
Yeah, totally. And you obviously mentioned how this is repeated across the world, and maybe we could speak a little bit about the situation in the UK now and the debate going on there. So you mentioned ULEZ, which is the ultra low emission zone scheme that we've seen in London at the moment, and potentially we could see expanding it out to other cities, where if you have a certain car, which is generally an older car that releases a certain amount of emissions, you have to pay something every day. It's like a tax for your car. And there was a huge backlash against this. And this was basically the deciding factor in the Uxbridge by-election. So Uxbridge, Boris Johnson's old seat. There was a by-election there, and the Tories managed to cling on to it with just a few hundred votes over what they said it was, a one-topic sort of by-election on ULEZ. And that's what swung it. So Tories run a very anti-ULEZ kind of campaign. And it's very difficult because that's sort of opened up this debate now where everyone's sort of worried of whether we talk about green issues in the election, of how they might turn people. We have this debate around the 2030 car ban of petrol and diesel bans, which is petrol and diesel cars, which would basically see new petrol and diesel cars, the sale of them, be banned. So still have second-hand cars be sold. And, Rishi has said that we're going to continue with that ban. We're still going to hit it. But he's getting lots of backlash already from people in his own party. And, once it gets closer to the time, will we see him roll back on that to sort of quell disagreements in his party? And you often see that as we're leading into elections, how to keep the peace behind closed doors among politicians, as opposed to have the public as being the priority. I have to say this is a difficult issue across the board anyway. I, as a journalist, we at the Mirror do lots of green reporting, but as a journalist, you sometimes find it difficult to find those headlines in the way that you might with other stories, because it takes time to talk about things that are imagined, and that's what green activists really want. They want us to have this shift between thinking about right now, what's the pay that I have to have on my high emissions car, and think about our imagined children, the imagined generations, and what kind of world they are going to be living in. Can we really stand up and be selfless humans, or are we too focused on the days ahead of us?
Yeah, exactly. And of course, when it comes to things like ULEZ, it is still affecting us, but it's in such a way it's invisible. You cannot see the impact that car pollution is having on your lungs or your heart or your brain or your chances of having Alzheimer's. And these things, they're not quite known yet. Some of the links aren't quite there. Some of the links are there. ULEZ, as John says, is not about the environment. It's about public health. And so when people say, it's a war on motorists, actually, it's trying to find a way that motorists and pedestrians all live a bit longer, which last time I thought about it, that's not what you call a war. Never.
Let's look at Rishi Sunak up in his helicopter anyway, and the emissions going on there. Is he with motorists? I'm not so sure.
I'll tell you what's more on motorists is bloody potholes. And if he ever used the road as opposed to the skies, he would know how bad they are. Now, what do you think, everybody? Do you think that there is a better change in the debate that needs to happen about this? We start talking about the cost of not doing these things. Because it comes, like you said, Sophie, back to COVID, doesn't it? And all the lockdowns and stuff. People were talking about what we need to do to stop having the terrible imagined disaster of many, 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 many deaths. And so we did something. And then because those deaths didn't happen, some people say, well, we didn't need to do it then, did we? The reason it didn't happen is because you did the thing. And but there's still that argument as to whether the lockdowns and the vaccines and all that stuff was actually necessary, because well, COVID didn't kill lots of people. Well, that's because we were better than every previous pandemic we've ever had. But it's kind of amazing to me, going back to this Hawaii story, that 9 years ago this was predicted. Something could have been done, but absolutely wasn't. And I can remember, Sophie, probably before you were born, 30 years ago in my geography GCSE, we were being taught about the greenhouse effect and climate change, and we were told just exactly what was going to happen. And nothing really has been done in those 30 years. So the fact it wasn't done 9 years ago as well is kind of not surprising. But I suppose it was more imagined then, like in the 80s and the 90s, whereas now there isn't time really left to say, there's not much space in which to argue that this isn't happening.
Exactly. Yeah, totally. We need action. We need it now. And I think people do really care. And you look at polling, you know, Brits understand that this is something that's happening. You know, yeah, we've had a rainy summer this year and everyone says, oh, well, I wish it was like last year. I think we're all forgetting what it like when it was 40 degrees that day in the UK. We don't have the infrastructure to be dealing with these kind of things. And we need to actually, you know, sit and think about what climate change looks like in the real world right now. I think sometimes we look at disaster films and we think it means, you know, the whole of the UK will be underwater. And right now, I can still walk on the path. That means climate change is not happening. But we look around ourselves, look at these rising temperatures. Was your holiday cancelled this year? And maybe that is a way that we get through to politicians, we get through to people, and everyone to care about it a bit more. So think, you know, what's happening in your life? How has this affected you? And look what's happening in Hawaii right now. We've seen the death toll at nearly 100 now, and it's only going to go up. And people have lost their homes, their livelihoods. They've lost everything. And just because it's happening to us right now doesn't mean we shouldn't have the ability to understand how deep that impact is, and understand that it's only going to get worse, and it might be on your doorstep before you know it.
Yeah, and it's not like we haven't been told, is it? And one of the things that's causing a lot of these, not causing, but the climate change caused a lot of problems to the developed world, where generally the weather is a bit more temperate, shall we say, not as bad as it is in equatorial regions. And so a lot of the climate change might be happening somewhere else, but the effects do still come here. And one of those is that one of the main stories of the day, probably the story the government would rather forget, which is to say the story it spent all last week trying to spin into a bit of positive news. And in the end, it went viral. That's not really quite the right word. It went bacterial in a very bad way. So last week, it was Small Boats Week in the government media grid. They wanted to look tough on migration and mass movements of people, many of which are linked to climate change. And in the course of 5 days, this brilliant government opened up a poisonous barge for asylum seekers who are not the source of any immigration problems. They lost a £400,000 drone in the Channel. They had a hard drive containing evidence stolen by people traffickers. And then they had to evacuate the barge where everyone died from Legionnaire's disease. And then at the weekend, 6 people died when the boat that they were crossing the Channel in capsized. And so now there are calls for the government to open up safe routes to stop these tragedies happening. Now, Sophie, I can distinctly remember not long ago, Suella Braverman saying she would open up safe routes, but only after they'd stopped coming. She's now being asked to do it the sensible way, which is to have the safe routes in order to stop them going on the boats. Why did she ever say it the other way around? So
I mean, I know this whole situation is becoming ever more heartbreaking, and the way that we've watched it in recent times, especially, you know, in the last few months, what with the illegal migration bill going through Parliament and eventually being passed, is the kind of toxicity around this debate. And we do hear things like that being said all the time. We even, you know, we've come to hear the term illegal migrants and illegal migration. So, you know, illegal migrants, you know, a person in and of themselves cannot be illegal. The only reason they are being classed as illegal is because there are no safe and legal routes, or very, very few that are very inaccessible to most people.
They're being denied the right to be a legal migrant, which I'm sure they would prefer.
And the UN have condemned that. Several charities have condemned that. We can see in the Mirror today, lots of charities calling for safe and legal routes to be expanded, to be made, to be created. to stop people having to go on these channel crossings. I mean, we could talk about the people smuggling gangs, and that's, a big part of Labour's policy as well, which I think is they actually have some policies to try and properly break these people smuggling gangs by working with French authorities and French police. But it's not going to change. We have to look about why these people are choosing to still come over. It's a huge decision. Imagine risking your life coming over in a small boat. You know how dangerous they are. They're not blind to the fact that people have died doing this crossing. They know the risk, and yet they're still risking it all to come.
Yeah.
Paying thousands of money to these people smugglers. It's not going to change by these imaginative deterrents, such as Rwanda. And I think we need to think about, people are going to risk their lives no matter what. Actually,
yeah, there was a study or something. It was in one of the papers at the weekend, talking about the fact that if you go and ask anyone who's moving across borders whether they are thinking about the policy for migrants in their destination country, the answer is no. They're thinking about the crap hole they're currently in, and that place seems better.
Yeah.
That's that. Adam 87 says this is economic immigration of 95% men and Albanian immigrants. No, it isn't, Adam. The Albanians have stopped coming because there was a returns agreement. The men who died in the Channel at the weekend were Afghans. And if you are from Afghanistan, you are a slam dunk to get asylum because you have a damn good reason to leave. It's called the Taliban, Adam. And if you want to be a young man in a country where the Taliban's in control, then you may well decide that you would like to be a young man going to a safe country in order to have jobs, and because you're the strongest and you're the one who's most likely to get there without being raped and murdered, and that you can then bring your family over behind you so that they're all safe. That is the kind of thing that is happening. They are not economic migrants. And if they were economic migrants, they would be no different from the Angles and the Saxons and the Jutes who came over here after the Romans left. All right? And the Normans. I could go on, Adam. Dan said it was in French waters. They're not our responsibility. They were being escorted, I think, Sophie, from French waters into English waters. And what nobody quite works out in the Channel is there is no international waters where no one's in charge. It's French, and then it's English, right? So depending where they are, they're the responsibility of that nation. And that's all there is to it, that you can't push them back into another country's responsibility.
And it's also the way that, with this, the way that it's gone on, even I mentioned about the wording before, but the use of the word migrant has become this term to mean something very particular now. And what we have to remember about when we are saying things like whether it's our responsibility or not our responsibility, is that we're talking about people, often children, sometimes who've come from really awful situations. They're escaping war, they're escaping persecution. We are so lucky that we do not know what that feels like and what you might be feeling in that situation. And for us to, be sitting in our homes, and that's not to say we have many issues in the UK as well, and cost of living crisis. Don't want to demean those in any way, but to be able to sit and say, well, it's not really our responsibility, but 6 people have died, and I think we can all just show a bit of humility. We're not in wildfires in Hawaii right now. We're not having to escape war in a small boat right now. We can be sitting here reading it on our laptops, in our papers, and making comments. And I think, we don't know the situations. Yeah,
we are extremely rich and extremely well off.
Exactly, and I think there's also a point to be made when we will probably speak about this a bit more. But so the barge, we obviously wanted to speak about that, the Bibi Stockholm barge, where there's been pure chaos that has erupted with that situation last week, with the first asylum seekers being moved on to there. So this is the big Home Office barge, which is allegedly going to be cheaper than housing asylum seekers in hotels.
Not at the moment, it isn't. It's an awful lot more expensive than a hotel.
An awful lot more expensive. And I will say, disclaimer, that the Home Office haven't released any of the figures, and they are refusing to. We'll release it next year in our annual reports. That seems very suspicious to me. But that we had a Legionella outbreak. So Legionella bacteria can be very deadly because it can cause Legionnaire's disease, which is an infection in the lungs, a type of pneumonia, we've had the whole thing that's been kind of coming out of this over the weekend, which has made the situation far worse, is when did the Home Office actually find out about the Legionella bacteria that's in the water and came from the pipes on the boat, we believe. So we had some migrants first move in on Monday. They were moving in across the week up until Thursday, when 6 more migrants came onto the boat. Actually, kind of we're finding out that perhaps the Home Office informally found out about Legionella bacteria Tuesday, Wednesday evening, and yet continued to move people onto the boat on Thursday. So we are seeing a real mess behind the scenes. And I will say, just in response as well to some of the questions that we've had, that these weren't the majority of people that were on the Home Office barge also did not even come over on small boats. So we've got several ideas of a situation in our head of, are they a French responsibility? They're coming on small boats. It's the people smuggling gangs' responsibility. We should be blaming them, and we should be blaming this person. Actually, we had, as Susie mentioned, Afghan refugees on there. Also, the situation we have to remember in Afghanistan, largely things got very worse for people there, and we had the fall of Kabul after the US and British forces withdrew very quickly. So all of these things are interlinked in some way. Likewise, in that, we have to think about the legacies of colonialism, the legacies of the British Empire. Why do lots of people want to come to the UK? Yes, they may have family here. Also, because English is a global language, because of when when British Empire was conquering the world and everyone knew England. I'd want to go to a country that spoke the language that I
speak the
really
language. Yeah,
it's
maybe you had something
on.
else living there could help you out. But the thing is, we've got people like Adam, who has heard this stuff. He's heard the things we've said before. He's heard this stuff, and he still thinks that they're economic migrants. And he still probably thinks, and this is what the government would like people to think, which is the people on the barge were illegal and they were all on the small boats. As you said, they weren't anything to do with small boats. They were asylum seekers. They weren't illegal. They're mostly going to have genuine cases and get given leave to remain. And they certainly shouldn't have been in a place that was covered in Legionella. And if it was you or me that was running away from a country that was on fire, you know, if our houses were on fire and we just wanted to go to the next door house to have a cup of tea and they refused to let us in, we'd think that was pretty off, wouldn't we? Mike says, are we sure Suella isn't actually on our side? She's come up with loads of evil sounding policies against refugees that they all seem to fail expensively and make people mad at the government. They don't seem to have stopped any refugees either, Mike. And it's got to be said, I really hate talking about small boat migrants, because migrant is the overall umbrella term for everyone who moves somewhere. The people on boats are asylum seekers, which are a very, very narrow section of the migrants who come to the UK, tiny proportion. And they are genuinely, usually, legally, have a good call to be here and have a right to remain. The fact that they've paid a people trafficker is because the government that tells you the asylum seekers are the problem won't let them have some other route to come here. And as Sophie's just said, this is actually, it's about failure of government policy at every level, because the guys who've left Afghanistan is almost exactly 2 years since the US and the UK pulled out of Kabul, having utterly given up on that country and leaving its residents to their fate under the Taliban. I mean, this is literally, it's a tragedy of our own making. I mean, Britain left Afghanistan to its own ends. It did not do anything to make sure that the Taliban did not take over. It create a situation in which lots of young men would want to get out very, very quickly and take their families with them afterwards. So it's about a failure of asylum policy, refugee policy, foreign policy, defence policy. And now it keeps being said that there should be a government policy. I can't quite believe I'm saying this, but whereby we join Russia and Belarus in withdrawing from the European Convention on Human Rights, because then we could stop being quite so humane to refugees. I'm not quite sure where I've seen us being very humane up till now, but is that really going to happen, Sophie? Are we going to withdraw from that convention? Because surely it would also mean that we dehumanise and remove the rights of every single British citizen too, doesn't it?
Well, this is, again, one of those really difficult ones where we're seeing in-party fighting within the Conservatives. We've consistently heard from Rishi Sunak that we don't need to leave the European Convention on Human Rights because actually we can stop small boats, we can do the Rwanda plan, we can do it all within the convention. Suella Braverman has very much voiced her views on wanting to leave, and we had Robert Jenrick, Immigration Minister, last week on the broadcast round basically saying, we will do whatever it takes and whatever is required. And when he was pressed on whether we'll leave, he said, whatever we need to do, we'll do. So he's not refusing it, but we're also not getting any confirmation on it. And it's something we're going to have to keep a close eye on, because as you say, do we really want to be coming outside of this hugely well-regarded international human rights scheme to sit alongside countries like Russia and Belarus? I don't know.
And the impact
a question for the public.
Yeah, but the impact that would have on trade deals, on international business, on your ability to get a visa to go on holiday to Turkey, if Turkey doesn't have a visa agreement because they think we're scumbags because we've left the blasted Convention on Human Rights. There's lots of other knock-on effects to this. It's not just about refugees or immigration, generally speaking. Thank you for all that, Sophie. Thank you for explaining it all to us. But now we have, after what a depressing series of stories, fires, climate change, inhumanity, we have found some good news. There is some in the world, and here it is. Now, there are some people trying to clean up the mess that humans make, and one of them is a professor in the US who was gazing into the fire one night when a solution to the world's plastic problem suddenly hit him, just like an apple on top of the head, like that. Now, watching the smoke go up the chimney, he wondered if by melting the plastic you could isolate some of the waxy compounds and use it to make soap, because there's some chemical similarities between them. And by Jove, it turns out that you can. It opens up whole new possibilities for recycling and plastic pollution in general. Sophie, is this proof there's always something more useful that can be done if you just think about it and you're not Suella Braverman?
Always. And it's that sense of creativity and innovation that we need with thinking about the climate crisis. You know, we went through this period, and I can remember, and it was sort of this like boom where we sort of vilified plastic, and plastic was the evil. And you got all these self-help books that said 101 ways to rid yourself of plastic. And you know what? This shows another side to the argument. Plastics aren't going to go away. They take, thousands of years to decay. They're not just going to disappear. Actually, instead of burying them in the ground or putting them at the bottom of the ocean in the big plastic garbage space or whatever it's called, we can use them to be useful and to make other things. And, that's what we need with going forward in the climate crisis. We've invented a lot of stuff that are bad for the environment. How can we change it into something else?
Exactly. That would be handy, wasn't it? Although I'm not really sure about washing in like old crisp packets and stuff. I mean, would you come out of the shower smelling like what's-its? Would that be okay? Sometimes, I mean, there are times that licking your own armpit and getting the taste of what's-its would be quite welcome, isn't it? But we'd have to see. Thank you, everyone, for taking part so far. Thank you, Sophie, for explaining all that to us. If you're listening to us on podcast, please leave us a review, because it helps other people find us and find out some of the facts about immigration and not just the stuff people see randomly written on Facebook by someone who has no idea and hasn't checked it. Adam, if you're still watching, sorry for picking on you, but put your hand up, mate. And if you're around on Wednesday, come back for another edition of the News Agenda, where I'll be here at 9 o'clock, hopefully without any technical problems. Till then, everybody, thanks very much, and tatty bye.